Welcome back. We are joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran, an author, and a former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. So thank you for coming back on. It's great to see you. I I want to talk to you about this recent interview by President Putin. That is, he outlined what appears to be now expanded objectives, we can call it. That is, he called for taking all of Novorossiya under Russian control, which would then include everything up to Odessa. He talked about these buffer zones being lost in Kharkov, Sumy, essentially as a punishment for Kursk, as well as having obvious strategic objectives. And this is happening also as many of the front lines are cracking. I was wondering, do you see this as a new stage of the war, or how are you assessing this I guess new rhetoric coming from the Russian president?
Well, first of all, I think that President Putin has said more than once since the beginning of this war that Kharkov and Odessa are historically Russian-speaking cities. So I hesitate to say that it was always the objective, but I think most Russians believed from the beginning that if they were going to do this, those two cities would have to end up in Russian hands. Secondly, I think he's looking at the reality that the security zone for Russia's interests and safety has to be much larger than originally planned or anticipated. Let's face it, Ukraine has become a much more dangerous irritant over time than I think he expected it to. Ukraine itself as a nation, I would describe it as close to dead. But we have this facade of a government in Ukraine with an infrastructure of supporters, not much from the population, but hardcore supporters, thousands of mercenaries and foreigners, and they are able to launch periodically missiles and drones to create the illusion that there is some real power or influence there in the hopes of attracting more money. And I think you know that Zelensky wants $90 billion from Donald Trump, and Trump actually sat with him and talked to him, to my surprise. And to my horror, I'm told he's considering it. I hope not, but, anything is possible these days. So I think that's a signal that there are plans afoot now, military plans, to make those things a reality. I don't think the Sumy exercise is necessarily a punishment. I think it's just a realistic appraisal that says, if we don't control this territory, we have no security in Russia. Russia cannot be secure. So Novorossiya, which was always, I think, in the back of everybody's mind, is going to become a reality. And I would certainly do that if I were in his position. No question about it.
Well, he also said that the objective of NATO in this war was the strategic defeat of Russia. Indeed, only 2-3 days ago, Mike Pompeo even tweeted this, that that's the only acceptable outcome, that the strategic defeat of Russia. Now, I assume that Putin isn't going to allow this, but at the same time, he's seeing the Europeans increase their direct involvement in this war. How do you see him managing this, though? Do you think, as many argue, that he might decide that it's necessary to strike a European country, or do you think he will only look to essentially defeat Ukraine?
I think he's been asked privately, inside his inner circle, Mr. President, how bad must it get before we strike back? Now, we've watched the strikes periodically reach the outskirts of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Rostov, and so forth. They've hit some refineries, they struck a missile manufacturing facility, but they've also killed Russian civilians and destroyed Russian civilian infrastructure. I don't want to say that he's decided that he's had enough, but I think he is at the point now where he recognizes this can no longer be not necessarily ignored, but taken in stride. In other words, it's time for some form of action. So that's number one. Number two, militarily, he is in a position to do any number of different things. He can take Odessa very suddenly and very quickly. He has the forces on hand, concentrated to do it. He'll have to do some more work with regard to the destruction of some of the drone assembly points, where the materials come in from Europe, and the drones and the missiles are then assembled as components of a larger system and then launched at him or launched at Russia. He'll have to target those and administer some serious destruction, but that's not difficult to do. I don't think he has an inexhaustible quantity of Oreshniks, but he's got a lot. There's no question about it. He's had plenty of time to build up that surplus. So that much would happen. Odessa has to fall. Once Ukraine is landlocked and he is in a position to reach out to the Russian population in Moldova, which I'm sure he will, then the question is, what are the Europeans really going to do? And the truth is, they're not capable of doing much. You and I know that. But the Russians have been told otherwise. Now, what do I mean? From the very beginning, when you saw these fools in Ukraine run around with Nazi symbols on their uniforms, that was a red flag for the Russians. And that was something that anybody in Russia could point to as evidence for something that was wrong and had to be destroyed. Now it's gotten worse. And I would argue it's worse because you have European leaders like this man, Merz, who makes extremely dangerous, incautious remarks, along with his defense minister, von der Leyen, and others, about how Germany is going to build up into some giant military power with the obvious purpose of threatening Russia. You have similar statements coming out of other European countries and leaders. I don't know what the new Starmer Light will be like. I'm sure we'll get another version of Starmer, only less impressive, if that's possible. Macron is still with us. These people are all saying ridiculous things about Europe's potential to defeat and destroy Russia. If you're sitting in Russia and you're listening to this, and this material is, this material is being transmitted through the Russian media to the Russian people. It's not being censored. It's not being modified. It's being transmitted. What does the average Russian conclude? It's 1941 again. Here we go again, another European invasion of Russia. Now, you and I know that's absurd. You could take the entire British army, French army, whatever it passes for a German army. Throw in the Danes, the Norwegians. What are they going to do? Where are they going to go? They couldn't even defend the Baltic littoral. They couldn't defend Western Ukraine. Who are we kidding? So what are you talking about? It's nonsense, but it's dangerous, and it's eliciting a very dangerous response from Russia. People don't seem to understand it. President Putin doesn't have to create a boogeyman for the Russians to fear. We've done that for him, and we continue to do it. So it's very easy for him to announce new measures, expansion of reserves. They've already got a Russian army today that's well over 1 million. It's brilliantly organized, well-equipped, well-trained. I think it's well-led. I think many of the weak links in the chain of the officer corps and the senior ranks have been eliminated. If you were going to pick a time and a place to fight the Russians, this is a bad one. Don't do it. You're stupid to even consider it. So I think Putin knows all of these things. I think he's still going to move very methodically because that's his nature. But I think Odessa is going to come under attack and it's going to be seized. Now, can he do more than that? Yes, he probably can. Will he? I don't know. I have listened to voices in Russia say this will not end until we are in Kiev and we absolutely eliminate this regime. I think a lot of people have reached that conclusion. And they don't understand why we have not done more. The thing that's most tragic about the entire picture, Glenn, is that in Russia, at any rate, people genuinely like Americans. And they think that Americans and they are alike. Now, that's not really true. We would make good strategic partners for different reasons, but we are as different from the Russians as the Chinese are. That doesn't mean we can't get along, but I think they have developed this view that we have a lot more in common than we do, and at the same time, they have this very positive picture of Trump. They think Trump is really a good person, that he really wants the best. They don't understand what they're dealing with. The reality TV star who migrates in the direction of whatever promises to make him look good. That's not what they're accustomed to. All you have to do to contrast Trump with President Putin, look at Putin on the stage, the way he behaves, the way he holds himself, how he dresses, how he speaks, The audience, look at the people that are in the audience. How do they dress? How do they look? How do they comport themselves? Then look at what we've got in the United States for a president. It's totally different, completely unrelated. Putin is as close to a czar as you're going to get in the modern world. And he does have one foot in the czarist world. He's got another foot in the Soviet world. He knows both. And he has moved Russia down, I think, a very good path to unity and prosperity because he understands that those are critical. With unity and prosperity, you also get security. No one in the United States thinks like that. Trump doesn't even consider those things. But for better or worse, they think we're friends. They think Trump is a good guy.
Well, Trump, he did, well, it seemed like he was going for a diplomatic path. It seemed that he thought it was better for the US to get along with Russia and essentially, well, bring them over to our side of the ledger. But since those days, he now appears to have embraced his inner Biden. That is, he's made this his war as well. I mean, part of this is also linked up, I think, with this new narrative which is just coming out of every media outlet across the West now, which is that Ukraine is winning again. What do you think? What do you think the calculations by Trump is? I mean, you mentioned he might start sending billions in aid again to Ukraine. So, what is the strategy here? Will the U.S. go back into, well, deeper into the war against Russia?
First and foremost, you must understand that there is no strategy. There never has been. We had something resembling a strategy as a result of George Kennan, his Mr. X article, and what then subsequently became a containment. Since then, our strategy has been to retain control of the 750 bases in 80 countries, to continue to exert influence in our pursuit of financial hegemony. And see, what underpins financial hegemony in the American mind has been military hegemony. So the American thinks, well, if I spend $1 trillion on defense, I get all these benefits, including financial hegemony around the world. It's all nonsense, but that's the way people think. Americans think of defense as you go to the supermarket, you buy something off the shelf, a loaf of bread, butter, or, a roast beef, whatever it is. And that's defense. Well, we buy this, we've got defense. No understanding of how you build military power or anything else. So this is what confronts President Putin. This is what confronts the Iranians. The same thing. There is no strategy. And whatever President Trump wakes up in the morning and decides to do is what we do. And he is not planning the systematic demise or destruction of Russia. Absolutely not. Wouldn't know how to begin. So what's he trying to do? Well, he's trying to do whatever he thinks is going to benefit him and his presidency. And a little down the line, well, it may be helpful to America. How he defines that is beyond me. I have no idea. I see no benefit to us from involvement in Ukraine in any way. I see no benefit to us strategically from attacking Iran. So, somebody says, well, what are those benefits? I haven't got an answer because it sounds stupid to me. But the problem is that's where we are. That's all that you've got at this point. So I understand that there was supposedly a recent meeting involving President Trump and his inner circle and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and maybe some other military leaders to talk about what do we do if we resume bombing with the goal of, quote unquote, finishing the job. That's about as crazy as here's $90 billion, now go win your war in Ukraine. It's absurd. We know that everything that goes to Ukraine, about 50% of it, just disappears into corruption, the black hole of corruption. And what happens to the rest of it? Well, a lot of it is sold off. I mean, the Ukrainians have been furnishing Colombia and Venezuela and Mexico cartels with all sorts of interesting equipment and capabilities that were given to them by Europeans and by us. You would think President Trump is aware of that. I don't know if anybody ever tells him that. I don't know if he were told that he'd believe it. Who knows? But there is no strategic framework. There is no end state. It's all about how do we stay on top? In other words, how do we remain the world's financial hegemon and military hegemon? Well, we've just discovered that we are not the world's military hegemon. We've been defeated unambiguously. Instead of recognizing that and saying, oh, it's time to step back and reconsider what we're doing, he's talking about doubling down again. It's worse than insane. So when you see all these globalists that come out of the woodwork, I listened to Neil Ferguson the other day. Oh, Ukraine is now in a position where it could strike back and win. I don't know of anyone who is sane, who has visited Ukraine, who thinks Ukraine has a snowball's chance in hell of winning a war against Russia. What is much more likely now is that that Putin finally says, that's enough, no more. And remember, he's in a tough position. When I speak about Russia, I've always had people say, well, Macgregor, sure, you say this, the Russians could do this. You say the Russians are doing that. Well, if they can do all those things, why haven't they already won? Why haven't they crossed the river? Why haven't they entered Kiev? Why haven't they just marched west? In other words, nobody believes you until it's done. The burden of proof is on Russia right now to prove that it can do what it can. There's no thinking that says, listen, let's sit down. Let's bring this to an end quickly. This has gone on long enough. This is not in the interest of Europe, not in the interest of Ukraine, certainly not in the interest of Russia or the United States. So how do we end this? That should be the question. No one is talking like that. That's the tragedy.
Well, I think most of the public, as well as the political class, of course, you have the hawks, but a lot are just trapped, I think, by the narratives. If you argue that, well, we should negotiate a new security architecture for Europe that also accommodates Russian security concerns, and thereby removing Ukraine from the front line of a divided Europe, then the pushback will be, well, that's a pro-Russian thing to do. And instead claiming that, Ukraine is winning in a war it can't win, which is destroying the country and possibly taking us to direct war with Russia. This is somehow the pro-Ukrainian position. So there's no discourse around it. No one has unpacked the arguments. It's just it's sloganeering, very emotional sloganeering, and doing a lot of harm at the same time. But I agree though that, well, if Putin now decides this is enough, and they decide to escalate in a big way to put an end to this war, what would that escalation look like?
Well, I tried to describe it for you. I think first and foremost, they would move to seize Odessa and transform Ukraine into a landlocked country. Ukraine historically, and you know the maps, I don't know if you've ever shown those. Most Europeans that live in the West or live in Central East Europe, they don't understand Eastern Europe either. And so if you look at the maps historically, Ukraine is really not what Ukraine is today. It's a northern portion that reaches across to almost to Kursk. In other words, there's this sort of open area. It's an area, not a nation, in the strict sense of the word. So stripping Odessa from it is inevitable. It was never Ukrainian, never part of Ukraine. It was founded by Tsarist armies that conquered the area and threw out the Mongols and the Tartars and the Turks. So the question now is, what do you do at that point if you're in the West? You're going to try and counterattack? You try to throw the Russians out? Good luck. That's not going to happen. But I think the Russians can do that very, very quickly and very decisive. When I say quickly, the Russians are methodical, so they'll take months to do these things. They could also very rapidly enter Kiev. They could come down from the north, from Belarusia. I'm told they have tens of thousands of troops there, including something between 20 and 30,000 North Koreans that have not been committed to action, along with the force that is now in Sumy and dealing with the three fortress cities in the center. Those are about to fall, which means that you can reorganize and reconcentrate all of these forces in Ukraine and move them wherever you want. So I kind of see three potential moves. One is Odessa, one is across to Kiev, and another is down from Belarusia towards Kiev. That can be done. How they will do it, when they will do it, those are questions I couldn't possibly answer.
So you think taking Kiev could be a key objective then? I mean, this is the mother of all Russian cities, they say.
Yeah, well, it can't be ruled out. If you're sitting in Moscow right now and you're looking at the mess you got on your hands, and the West, if the West has to deal with a government in exile that sits in Lvov, okay, we don't have a map again, but if you go to Lvov, that area used to be part of Poland, Galician Poland. Then it became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, initially Austrian, then Austro-Hungarian. Uh, that's one problem. And the good news is that the Poles have recently discovered Ukrainians are back up to their old tricks, and it's gotten ugly between Warsaw and Kiev, and rightly so. I mean, how many times do you have to sit there and watch these Ukrainians celebrate people that murdered 100,000 Poles before you finally wake up and smell the coffee? And from the very beginning, I talked to Russians and they all said the same thing. Why don't they just turn Western Ukraine over to the Poles, let them deal with it? And everybody would laugh, say, because they know if the Ukrainians hate us, they hate the Poles more than they hate us, and it's going to be somebody else's problem, but let's get it off our plates. I think you could probably sit down at a table with all the states that border Russia and Belarusia right